What's up guys, in this video we're going to be tying a crystal woolly bugger with a complex twist, something just a little more buggy. To start, I'll be using a Tiemco U502 hook in size 2. For the bead, I'll be using a gold cone head bead, 1/4 inch size. I'll be using a sparse amount of 025 lead wire. And thread is UTC Ultra 140. You'll need some white saddle hackle or schlappen feathers, and you'll need some white marabou feathers as well. You'll also need some white UV flash polar chenille. So here I've got my cone head bead on my hook in my vise. As you can see, the bead is kind of a little lopsided, hangs down. This is part of the reason why I use the 025 lead weight, just to also give it a little bit more weight, but I really like to use it to stack up against that cone head. It keeps the cone head in place, doesn't allow it to move as much. Next, I take my 140 denier UTC thread, and I like to start behind the wire, or not the wire, but the lead, and I just kind of pinch the tag end of that lead, that way I can secure it in place. And also create a little bumper, and then I take my thread rearwards. Next I'll tie in my marabou. You'll notice most feathers have a downward bend to them. I like to tie this bend down towards the hook. I keep the tail here about length of the hook shank, and then I pinch down and I tie it in with first a loose wrap, and then I like to use a tighter wrap for my second wrap to really lock down the fibers. Normally I would clip off this excess marabou in front of my thread, and you're welcome to, but for this fly I like to wrap some of it down the hook shank to kind of help build an even body later on in the fly. And to cut it, good tip that I learned is to twist it and then snip. Makes a much cleaner cut, and you don't have all that extra marabou floating around everywhere. After I cut this marabou, I just take my wraps rearward and stop right at the start of my tail. Next I take my first piece of schlappen, and I like to use the ratty curved ones for this because they don't make good tails, but they make a good use for a fly like this where I'm just using them to taper up a body. I like to snip off the butt and then tear off some of the little small fibers, a little fluffy. I'll leave a little bit, but I get rid of most of them. Make a nice clean platform to tie in on. So I first tie one in, take a couple wraps to secure it. Next I take my UV white polar chenille, which mine is from a craft store in a bundle. I found it in this yarn sewing area, and it works just the same as some of the other UV polar chenille that I have. But I like to keep a nice clean edge, just like the feather, to tie in here. And you'll notice that when you stroke this UV chenille, that it wants to lay down one way and stick up the other. So I like to tie it in where if I were to stroke it towards the hook, the fibers would stand up. And then I take a second schlappen feather, same as before, cut the butt off, clean up the tip for a clean tie-in point, and I tie it on next to this UV polar chenille. We'll use this later to make a bit of a sandwich for the complex twist. After securing down this last schlappen feather, tie towards the head and stop right behind the bead. Next, I like to take the two feathers and sandwich the chenille between both of them, and I use this little alligator clip that I've got to kind of pinch everything together at the tips of the feathers. After I've got the material sandwiched together and alligator clipped, I take an old toothbrush or a wire brush and brush that material out to make it real nice and buggy. And before you twist, you kind of sometimes want to make sure that those butt ends are a little bit loose, otherwise they try and flare out on you onto the tail, and one wants to go the other way, and it kind of makes for a mess. So start your twist, continue to brush out that fiber. And as I make my twist here, I like to pinch all the material closest to the hook and try and pull it back towards the tail of the fly. That way I'm not trapping down any fibers. And here sometimes you've just got to keep brushing it out. You see some trap fibers as you're going. And for this, I felt like a wire brush was a little better than a toothbrush. Just kind of depends on what you're working with. But give it a really good brush. It looks a lot more buggy. But again, take that pinch with your fingers and wrap around. And be careful of the hook. I don't know how many times I stuck myself tying these flies. But if you keep your pinched material back towards the tail of the fly, it makes for a better presentation and also makes it easier to wrap. I could use the rotary vise feature that I have, but sometimes I just find it better to kind of wrap that material around, pinch it down to the hook to kind of lock it in place, and then slowly readjust the material on the other side. That way my alligator clip with the material doesn't go spinning back the opposite direction and undo my twist. And you can stop in between and use a brush as well. It helps brush it back. Sometimes these fibers do get trapped no matter how hard you try to pinch it and pull it back towards the tail. Once I get up to the hook bead, I like to kind of palmer it like a marabou collar, and then take that thread and wrap it over a couple of times, and then I take it back and I try and pull all the material back as best I can and wrap 3 or 4 times in front of the material right behind the hook eye, and then clip out my material. I take a couple additional wraps here with the thread, making sure that nothing's trapped in. I try to keep those fibers going back, and then I just whip finish here. After I whip finish, I'll cut my thread. I usually add a dab of head cement here as well. And then one thing I like to do is just kind of brush it out a little bit more, brush it back, kind of get an idea for it. And the reason I like to tie in that butt section is so it's bigger in the back on the feather, and then when you're looking at it from the front, all the tapered feathers kind of go towards the head. But a little glue never hurts anything here. Before this glue gets too hard, I usually come back in and double check one more time that nothing's sticking out in front. As you can see, there's a piece of UV flash sticking out in front of this fly, so I'll clip that. While there's nothing wrong with the original woolly bugger, I do like using this complex twist woolly bugger to get a more buggy fly, a little more baitfish style looking pattern. Thanks for watching.